The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Hester Price always thought was a strange day for a life to change. She had been standing at the window of the boarding house on Dundas Street, watching the ice break up on the river below, when Mrs. Kowalski slid the envelope under her door without knocking. That was how Mrs. Kowalski communicated, slides and thumps and the occasional pointed silence. Hester had learned to read the sounds the way some people read weather. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize, the letters careful and slightly uneven, like a man who'd learned penmanship from someone who didn't much care for it either. There was a return address in the upper left corner, Stoneridge, Alberta. She hadn't expected a reply. She'd sent 3 letters in January. One to a widower in Manitoba, one to a farmer outside Lethbridge who turned out to already be spoken for, and one to a ranch called Coldwater Flats near a town she'd never heard of. She'd answered the advertisement because the wording was plain. No promises of comfort or companionship or a new beginning. Just rancher, widower, 2 children. Needs a woman who can work. Right if serious. She was serious. She had $42, a landlady who'd stopped being patient in February, and a brother in Halifax who'd made it quietly clear there was no room for her there. She was 29 years old, and she had been many things. A schoolteacher's assistant, a dry goods clerk, a wife for 14 months before the influenza took Colin and left her with nothing but his debts, and a name no one in their town could say without a look of pity attached to it. She opened the letter. It was short. 4 sentences. The rancher's name was Dunbar Vane. He had read her letter. He was not a man who wrote much. If she was still interested, she should come before the end of April, because the spring work wouldn't wait for anyone. That was all. No pleasantries. No description of himself, his land, his children, no reassurances of any kind. Just the facts, laid out the way you'd note an appointment in a ledger. She wrote back that afternoon. She said she would come the 2nd week of April. She arrived in Stoneridge on a Thursday morning after 2 days on the train and 4 hours on a mail wagon driven by a man named Bert, who smelled of tobacco and said almost nothing, except to warn her twice that the roads were bad from the melt. He was right. By the time they turned off the main road and started up the rutted track toward Coldwater Flats, Hester's back ached and her hat had been knocked sideways. So many times she'd finally just taken it off and held it in her lap. The ranch appeared through a stand of bare poplar trees, not the way places appeared in stories, dramatically, all at once. It came in pieces. A fence post, then another, a roof line, then a barn, weathered gray, one hinge on the large door replaced with a length of twisted wire. Then the house itself, low and wide, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front and needed painting badly enough that you noticed it before you noticed anything else. A man was standing by the water trough when the wagon pulled in. He didn't come toward them. He waited, which Hester noted. He was taller than she'd pictured, though she hadn't pictured much. Dark-haired, going gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been set in irritation some years back and had simply stayed that way. He wore a heavy canvas coat, and he stood with his weight shifted to his left side, his right hand gripping the top rail of the fence beside him in a way that wasn't casual. It was the grip of someone who needed it. When she climbed down from the wagon, he looked at her with gray eyes that didn't soften and didn't harden, they just looked. "Miss Price," he said. "Mr. Vane." Bert tossed down her trunk from the back of the wagon and touched the brim of his hat and left without ceremony. She appreciated that. Dunbar Vane glanced at the trunk, then back at her. "Children are inside," he said. "Supper's at 6. Reverend Aldridge comes Sunday. We can do it then if that suits you." She understood he meant the wedding. "That suits me," she said. He nodded once, picked up the near end of her trunk with his left hand, and began dragging it toward the porch. He didn't ask for help. She picked up the other end anyway. He stopped, looked at her, said nothing. They carried it inside together. The children were 9 and 6. The girl's name was Blythe. No, wait. She had been looking at the list in her memory wrong. The girl was named Cecily, and she had her father's gray eyes and a way of standing in doorways and watching that reminded Hester uncomfortably of someone who had learned to be careful. The boy was named Tomas. Not Thomas, he corrected her the first time she said it wrong. Very firmly, the way 6-year-olds sometimes correct things as if the whole world depends on precision. He had a gap between his front teeth and a toy horse with one leg missing that he carried everywhere. The house was clean in the way things are clean, when someone has made an effort without quite having enough time or enough hands. The floor swept, the dishes stacked but grease-dried on the stovetop, and a crack in the kitchen window patched with brown paper and axle grease. Hester noticed these things not to judge them, but because they told her what kind of work was waiting. There was a woman from town, she learned. A Mrs. Fenwick, who had been coming twice a week to cook and mind the children since Dunbar's wife died the previous autumn. He said this at supper the first night, matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. Eleanor had been sick for 2 years. Cecily knew. Tomas thought she'd gone somewhere and would come back when the snow melted, and they had not corrected him yet because they didn't know how. Hester looked at the boy pushing his potatoes around his plate, his toy horse propped against his cup. She didn't say anything about it that night. After supper, she washed the dishes, and Dunbar sat at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him, going over numbers she wasn't meant to see yet but could read easily enough in the set of his shoulders. Things were not good. She'd understood that from the advertisement. She understood it better now. She went to bed in the room that had been Eleanor's sewing room, on a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the sounds the house made, and thinking carefully about what she'd agreed to. They were married Sunday, as Dunbar had said, in the small parlor with Reverend Aldridge, and a neighbor named Gideon Marsh as witness. Cecily stood beside her father in a dress with a white collar that had been ironed with great care. Tomas fell asleep in the armchair before it was done and had to be carried to bed. Reverend Aldridge shook her hand afterward and said he hoped she would be happy here. Dunbar said nothing. He refilled the Reverend's coffee cup and saw him out. That night, Hester sat alone in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. She thought about Colin. She thought about the particular silence of a house where a marriage had been and then wasn't. This silence was different. It wasn't empty, the way her silence in Toronto had been empty. It was crowded with things that hadn't been said yet. She thought that was probably better. Spring came in hard and fast the way it did on the plains, like it had somewhere to be. The mud was extraordinary. Hester's boots were ruined within a week, and she borrowed a pair of Dunbar's old ones that were 3 sizes too large and stuffed the toes with rags. He didn't comment on this when he saw her crossing the yard in them. She didn't ask for new ones. There wasn't money for new ones yet. She learned the rhythm of Coldwater Flats the way you learn a dialect, by listening first, speaking carefully, making mistakes, and adjusting. Cecily was the one who taught her most of it, gravely and without condescension, as if instruction were simply her natural mode of being. This gate latch sticks. The gray mare bites if you come from the left. Papa takes his coffee with no milk, and he doesn't like it mentioned if the tin's getting low. That last one made Hester look at her. Does he know you've memorized his preferences that closely? Cecily considered this. He doesn't like it when things change and no one tells him, she said. So I pay attention. 9 years old and already managing a household's emotions. Hester felt something firm and protective settle in her chest. Dunbar worked from before dawn until after dark most days. He walked with a cane. She hadn't seen this at first, because he'd been holding the fence when she arrived, and on Sunday he'd been standing still. She noticed it fully the first morning she came out to find him in the yard before breakfast, moving between the barn and the equipment shed. The right leg. Something in the knee or hip that had healed wrong, or maybe hadn't healed at all. He moved efficiently despite it, had clearly learned long ago to compensate, but by evening she could see the cost in the way he sat, the way he shifted weight off that side, the way his jaw tightened sometimes for no visible reason. She didn't ask. She watched. The 3rd week she started heating water in the evenings and leaving a basin and a clean cloth near the wood stove without remark. He didn't say anything. He used it. She noticed the 2nd night that he was there longer than the task required, just sitting with the heat on his leg, and she made sure the water was hotter after that, and she always managed to have something to keep herself busy in the kitchen, so the silence wasn't pointed. This was the closest they came to talking about it. The trouble started in May. She hadn't known there was a man named Orland Creech until she went to the general store in Stonebridge to settle an account Dunbar had asked her to handle. The woman behind the counter, a wide, kind-faced woman named Vera, not the Vera Sutton from the list but a different one, a Mrs. Vera Eklund, handed her the receipt and then hesitated. "You're Dunbar Vane's wife?" she said. "I am." Vera Eklund looked at the door, then back. "You'll want to know," she said, "that Orland Creech has been in here twice this week asking about the Coldwater Flats property lines." Hester kept her expression neutral. "Is he a surveyor?" "No." A pause. "He's Dunbar's cousin, first cousin. He was at the ranch for a few months last year, after Eleanor got sick." Another pause, shorter. "He left in December. Not on good terms." Hester thanked her and walked back to the wagon. She didn't say anything to Dunbar that night. She thought about how to bring it up, what she actually knew, what she was guessing. She knew the shape of the thing, had seen shapes like it before. A man alone, land that someone else wanted, the particular vulnerability of a household that was already stretched thin. She just didn't know the details yet. She found the details 6 days later, entirely by accident. She had gone into the small room off the main bedroom. It had been Eleanor's and she hadn't gone in before, had felt some border there she wasn't ready to cross, because Tomas had said he'd left his other boot in there. The room still held Eleanor's things. A dressing table, a small trunk, a stack of letters tied with kitchen string on the windowsill. The boot was under the dressing table. Hester picked it up. On her way out, she glanced at the letters. The string had come undone and the top envelope had slid sideways, and she could see the return address. Orland Creech, the previous October. 5 letters, maybe 6. She stood there for a moment, boot in her hand. She didn't read them. That wasn't what stopped her. She told herself that plainly. She didn't read them, because if she did, she would have to decide what to do with what she found, and she wasn't ready to do that, without understanding better what she was dealing with. She put the boot down on the floor of the hall and went back to the kitchen and started dinner. That night she asked Dunbar carefully about the property line on the east side. He looked up from his coffee. Why? I heard in town there'd been some questions about it. The silence was long enough that she thought he might not answer. My grandfather's deed, he said finally, didn't get registered properly. My father meant to fix it. He didn't. He set down his cup. Orland knows, and Orland wants the east quarter. Another pause. Orland wants the whole ranch. His voice was flat, not angry. Worse than angry, somehow, just stated the way you state a fact about the weather. He's been making offers to the bank since January. The bank is listening. She looked at him across the table. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. What does he have, she said, evidence-wise? He has a letter my father wrote him, unwitnessed. Says the east quarter was meant to pass to him. And on your side, my word, my grandfather's original deed, and the fact that I've been working this land for 15 years. He paused. The bank doesn't find that as compelling as it should. Hester folded her hands on the table and thought. The letters, she said, the ones in Eleanor's room. He went very still. I didn't read them, she said. I found them by accident. I'm telling you that now so you know. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the poplars. Eleanor was keeping them, he said finally. She said they might matter someday. She was. He stopped, started again. She was more careful about those things than I am. She was right to be. He looked at her. Whatever's in them, Hester said, is either useful to you or it isn't. But you should know what you have. She didn't sleep well that night, and she suspected he didn't either. In the morning, he was at the kitchen table before she came downstairs, the letters open in front of him. He'd made coffee. He didn't look up when she came in, just pushed a cup toward her side of the table. She poured her own coffee and sat down and waited. He wrote to Eleanor, Dunbar said, because he thought she'd side with him. She was sick. He thought she'd want to secure something for the children before she died, and he offered to. He stopped. He was a man who stopped in the middle of sentences when the words became too costly. She'd noticed that. He offered to make arrangements for Cecily and Tomas, she said, in exchange for her persuading you to sign something. He nodded. And Eleanor kept the letters, everyone. Hester wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, Tomas was calling to the chickens in the particular earnest way he had, naming them things they had not agreed to be named. The letters show he knew the deed issue existed, she said. They show he was using Eleanor's illness as leverage. That's not just a property dispute. Dunbar looked at her. No, he said. It isn't. You need a solicitor. I know. A pause. I couldn't afford one in January. She looked at what was left in her small savings. Not hers anymore, really, but the particular arithmetic of a shared life meant she was allowed to include it in the calculation. $42 had become $31 after the trip and a few necessities. It wasn't enough, but it was something. I know someone in Calgary, she said. A woman I corresponded with once through a church society. Her husband's in law. I can write and ask if he handles property cases. She paused. It cost nothing to ask. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why are you doing this? It wasn't a suspicious question exactly. It was a man who was genuinely puzzled. A man who had expected, she thought, a cook and a caretaker, a solution to an immediate problem, and had not expected whatever this was. Because Cecily and Tomas live here, she said, and because it's right. He didn't say anything else. He looked down at the letters in his hands, and then he set them carefully in a stack and straightened the edges, the way you handle something that has turned out to matter. The solicitor's name was Mr. Cormac Finlay. He came from Calgary on a Thursday in late May, a neat man in a brown suit who asked good questions and listened well. Hester had arranged it, had written the letter, had met him at the station while Dunbar stayed at the ranch because the spring calving couldn't be left. She walked Finlay through what they had. The letters. The original deed. 15 years of tax records she'd found in a shoebox under the kitchen shelf while she was looking for something else. The testimony of neighbors who'd known the family for decades, which Finlay said would matter. Creech's claim is weak, Finlay said over coffee at the hotel before he left. The letter from the father is unwitnessed and the language is ambiguous. The bank may have been more interested in the possibility than the reality. He looked at her steadily. These letters your husband's wife preserved, they show knowledge and intent. That changes the character of what Creech was doing. Yes, she said. It does. Finlay nodded. I'll write to the bank directly. These things tend to become less interesting to interested parties when a solicitor's name appears at the bottom. She thanked him. He took the train back to Calgary. She drove the wagon back to Coldwater Flats alone under a sky that had gone wide and blue the way Alberta skies do in May, like they've decided to make up for everything. She told Dunbar that evening, all of it in order. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was how he listened to things that mattered. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been at this for 2 weeks, closer to 3. He looked at the table, then at her. You didn't tell me. I didn't have anything solid to tell you until today. She paused. I didn't want to say the words before I knew whether they'd hold. He absorbed that. Outside, a late evening light was doing something extraordinary to the poplar leaves, turning them a gold that seemed invented. Tomas was being put to bed by Cecily with the seriousness she brought to all such operations. The leg, Dunbar said after a long time. She waited. It was a horse, 4 years ago. Crushed the knee. It didn't. He stopped. Started differently. The doctor in Lethbridge said there wasn't much to be done. The doctor in Lethbridge may not have been the last word on it, she said carefully. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You're going to tell me to see another doctor. I'm going to tell you that a man I read about in a medical journal, a physician in Edmonton who trained in Montreal, has had success with certain joint injuries that were considered unsalvageable. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it will work. I'm going to tell you it might be worth asking. He was quiet for a long moment. You read medical journals, he said. I read whatever's available. She kept her voice even. I was a schoolteacher's assistant for 3 years. I've always liked knowing things. He was still looking at her with that expression she was beginning to learn. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had expected very little and was revising. The hot water, he said. In the evenings, does it help? A long pause. Yes, she nodded. Then we'll keep doing that. The bank sent a letter in June. Finlay had written to them, and the letter was brief and professional, and the bank was withdrawing its interest in Orland Creech's proposed arrangement, pending a review of the deed documentation. Creech came to the ranch 2 days later. Hester was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon on the gravel. She looked out the window. A man she didn't know, lean, with a way of sitting that suggested he was accustomed to being comfortable, climbed down from the seat and looked at the house with an expression she'd seen before on men who believed something belonged to them. Dunbar was in the yard. He'd seen the wagon, too. He was standing near the fence, his cane in his left hand, and he was very still. Hester dried her hands and walked out onto the porch. Creech looked at her. And who are you? Mrs. Vane, she said. Something shifted in his face. He hadn't known about her, or he'd known and hadn't considered her relevant. He looked past her at Dunbar. The banks changed their mind, he said. That's a temporary situation. It is, Dunbar said. Temporarily in my favor. The letter existed, Dunbar. Your father meant that land to come to me, and you know it. An unwitnessed letter, Hester said pleasantly, expressing an intent that was never acted upon. Written to a woman who was dying and saved every copy and evidence of what was being asked of her. She looked at him the way she used to look at students who had tried something and found it hadn't worked. That isn't a claim. That's a record of conduct. Creech stared at her. Our solicitor is Mr. Finlay of Calgary, she continued. If you have further questions about the deed situation, you're welcome to contact him directly. She paused. He enjoys those conversations. There was a silence, the kind that has a direction. Creech looked at Dunbar. Dunbar looked back at him with gray eyes that gave nothing away and hadn't for as long as Hester had known him. Creech got back in his wagon without speaking again. He didn't look back. Dunbar waited until the sound of wheels had faded completely. Then he looked at Hester on the porch. You enjoyed that, he said. A little, she admitted. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time she'd seen it move that way. She filed it away. July was hot and unrelenting, and the work was enormous. Hester had not grown up on a ranch, and she made mistakes, not catastrophic ones, but the kind that cost time, and time in summer on a working ranch was its own kind of currency. Dunbar corrected her without impatience, which surprised her. She'd expected curtness and gotten instruction instead. She began to understand that the leanness of his speech wasn't coldness. It was precision. He said what needed saying and left out the rest, and once she understood that, she stopped waiting for things that weren't coming, and started listening to what was actually there. Cecily had begun, somewhere around June, to look at Hester differently. Not with warmth yet, not quite. The girl was too careful for quick warmth, but with a kind of considered interest. She started bringing Hester things, a found stone that was the color of a winter sky, a page from an old catalog with a picture of a hat she thought was ridiculous and wanted a second opinion on, small offerings. Hester received them seriously and returned them in kind. A ribbon found at the bottom of her trunk, a story about a dog she'd had as a girl, an honest answer when Cecily asked, once very quietly, if Hester had ever had children of her own. No, she said. I was married before, briefly. He died. Cecily sat with this. Do you miss him? I miss who I thought the future was going to be, Hester said honestly. It's not always the same thing as missing the person. Cecily looked at her with those gray eyes and said, I know what you mean. She was 9 years old and she knew exactly what Hester meant, and Hester's chest did something complicated and irreversible. Tomas had given up deciding Hester was temporary sometime around the end of May. The exact moment was hard to pinpoint. It happened the way things happen with small children, which is to say gradually and then completely. He had started sitting next to her at meals of his own accord. He showed her the injured sparrow he was keeping in a box in the barn. He called her Hester, not Mama, which was as it should be, and which she would not have wanted otherwise, but he said the name with a particular familiarity that made it into something it hadn't been before. In August, a letter came from Mr. Finlay. The bank had formally closed the matter. The deed, filed with the supporting documents, was registered correctly now. Coldwater Flats was Dunbar's, recorded and legal, as it had always been in fact. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and then set it down and looked out the window at the yard, where Dunbar was working on the fence that had needed fixing since she arrived. Moving with the efficiency she'd come to know, the cane hooked over the rail. She brought the letter out to him. He read it, standing there, his hand on the rail. She watched him read it, watched something in his face do something it didn't often do, move and resettle. He handed it back to her without speaking. Good news, she said. Yes. He paused. Thank you, Hester. It was the first time he'd used her name. She had not realized until that moment that he hadn't been using it. She walked back to the house. Behind her, she could hear the sound of him working, the steady, methodical work of a man who intended to stay on his land. Fall came early that year, the way it sometimes did in Alberta, arriving without much ceremony and settling in. The poplars went yellow all at once, and then let go all at once, and the yard was full of leaves for 4 days and then wasn't. Hester had been corresponding with the physician in Edmonton. She had not told Dunbar this because she wasn't sure yet whether it was anything, and she had learned his preference for being told things only when they were solid. The physician's name was Dr. Aldrich Pemberton, and he had trained at McGill and spent several years at a clinic in London that specialized in joint repair. He had written back with questions she couldn't answer alone, and she had written back asking if he would consider a consultation, and he had written back saying he could be in Stonebridge in October. She told Dunbar on a Sunday evening. He sat with it. You've been writing to a doctor, he said. Since August? About my leg? About whether anything further might be done. She kept her voice steady. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to raise something that came to nothing. I'm telling you now because there's something real to tell. He was quiet for a while. The fire in the stove made its particular sound. I'm not asking you to agree to anything, she said. I'm asking you to speak with him, and if he says the same as the Lethbridge doctor, then we're no worse off for knowing. He looked at her across the kitchen, that look she had learned, the one that was revising something. All right, he said, Doctor. Pemberton arrived on a Wednesday and examined Dunbar in the parlor with a thoroughness that Hester listened to from the kitchen and pretended she was not listening to. Afterward, he sat with both of them at the kitchen table and said careful, qualified things about what he had found and what he thought might be possible and what the recovery would entail if Dunbar chose to try. It was not a guarantee. Pemberton was clear about that. A man who chose his words the way Dunbar did, she noticed, which made her trust him more. There was a possibility of meaningful improvement. There was also a possibility of none. Dunbar asked 3 questions. They were the right 3 questions. Pemberton answered them directly. After he left, Dunbar sat at the table for a long time. Hester did not say anything. She made tea. She set a cup near him and sat down with her own and waited. He trained at McGill, Dunbar said finally. Yes, that's a good school. It is. Another long silence. Cecily would have to manage, he said. The recovery time. Cecily is extremely competent, Hester said. She would have opinions about the management, and most of them would be correct. She paused, and I'd be here. He looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said, simply. Not as a reassurance, not as a declaration, just as information. The way he said things. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, she said, slowly, with the full attention of a man who knew what it cost to say something and therefore gave weight to it in others. Spring, he said. If we get through winter in decent shapes, spring. She nodded. Winter came and they got through it. Not easily. Nothing about Coldwater Flats was easy, and she had stopped expecting it to be, which she thought was probably the same thing as becoming a person who belonged there. The roof leaked over the back storeroom. One of the mares had a difficult foaling, and they were up through 2 nights in January, all of them, including Cecily, who refused to be sent to bed. And the foal made it, and Tomas named it Thursday, because that was the day and no one argued with him. By February, the kitchen was warmer. Not because anything had changed structurally. It was the same kitchen, but because it was a kitchen with 4 people in it now, more or less, and 4 people generate a particular kind of warmth that has nothing to do with the stove. Dunbar started talking to her more in the evenings, not dramatically more. He was still a man for whom speech was something deployed carefully rather than spent freely, but more. He told her about his grandfather's homestead, about Eleanor, about the 5 years before the injury when he'd been able to work the land the way he'd wanted to. She told him about Halifax, about the school, about Colin. She told him the true version, not the polished one. The version where she had also been a little relieved, which she was ashamed of, when the marriage turned out to have an end. He didn't flinch at the true version. She had expected him to. She filed this away too. In March she asked him, out of genuine curiosity, what he'd expected when she arrived. He thought about it for a while. Someone who needed the position, he said. Who would do the work and be decent with the children and not want more than what was here. And instead, the corner of his mouth did the thing she'd seen twice before. And instead, he said, and didn't finish it. She thought that was probably all right. The sentence didn't need finishing. The house was warm. The deed was filed. Thursday the foal was asleep in the barn. In a few weeks they would write to Dr. Pemberton in Edmonton, and then they would see what was possible. And whatever it was, they would manage it. Practically, plainly, the way they managed everything. Outside, the snow was beginning to do what Alberta snow did in late March, which was to remember that it didn't have to stay. Hester listened to it for a moment, and then she went back to doing what needed doing next, which was the particular ongoing work of a life that had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be exactly in the right place.